I'd like to start with a quote from Donald Rumsfeld. It was in response to a reporter's question regarding the war in Iraq. There are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know. So this statement sounds fairly convoluted, difficult to follow, and Rumsfeld was made fun of quite a bit after making this statement. But I think there's actually quite a bit of truth in this statement that impacts how we make decisions in our daily lives and in society as a whole, and the quality of those decisions. When we talk about knowledge, we think about actual knowledge levels. We think about things like facts. We think about, do we know the state capitals? Do we know who our senator is? Do we know how to do long division? That kind of thing. We also think about skills. Do we know how to change a tire? Do we know how to bake? Do we know how to drive a standard? That kind of thing. So we have these two kind of generally thought of ways of thinking about knowledge, facts and skills. And when we think about that in terms of solving our problems in our daily lives or in public policy, we come up with easy solutions. Think about things like healthcare, whether it's vaccinations, cancer screenings, that kind of thing. We think if we just educate people more, provide them with more information, they'll make better decisions, have better outcomes individually, and then better outcomes at the societal level as a whole. But as we can see with things like Surgeon General's warnings, we don't always get those outcomes that we expect from educating individuals. It's because when we think about knowledge in this way of actual knowledge, we ignore what people think they know. Ultimately, what people think they know is the actual driver of our behaviors. It's not our actual knowledge that leads us to choose to do something or support a politician or anything like that. It's what we think we know. So when we have these two kind of ways of thinking about knowledge, actual knowledge and our own perceived knowledge levels, we can come up with some conditions. So thinking about actual knowledge, it operates on a continuum. We can know nothing about a topic or know everything about a topic, or anywhere in between. Perceived knowledge is the same way. We can think we know nothing about a topic, or think we know everything about a topic, or anywhere in between. You put these two together, we can come up with some conditions. We can accurately assess our knowledge by not thinking that we know that much and being correct. We can also accurately assess our knowledge by thinking we know a lot about a topic and be correct. We don't typically have problems with these. These are kind of the ideal, right? However, when we misidentify our own knowledge levels, we can run into some problems. There's this idea of knowledge humility where we underestimate our actual knowledge levels. We don't think we know that much, but we actually know more. On the flip side, we have this idea of knowledge hubris, where we think we know a lot about a topic, but we actually don't know that much. So together we have this idea of knowledge congruence, how congruent is our actual knowledge level with our perceived knowledge levels. So what does this matter? A lot of outcomes are associated with this incongruence. For example, how we perceive risk is important. There was a study done that looked at junior high and senior high girls and their knowledge on safe sex practices. And the study found that the more that the girls thought that they knew about safe sex practices, the more likely they were to become pregnant over the next year. So exactly the opposite outcome that you would expect from knowing a lot about safe sex practices. So what happens here is that when we overestimate our knowledge levels, we actually don't see the risks that are available to us, or we think that we are able and capable of handling those risks, leading to more risky behaviors, negative outcomes there. On the flip side of that, when we underestimate our knowledge levels, we end up seeing risks that may not exist. We don't know how much we actually know, and we make up risk and in turn don't go through behaviors or the decision-making process in the appropriate way there. Information seeking is also very different depending on how we assess our knowledge. We all think about looking at purchasing a new vehicle or a new television and wanting to get information. We all look at expert reviews, that kind of thing. But what happens when we overestimate our knowledge levels? We ignore our friends, family, acquaintances, because we assume that we know more than they do. So we completely leave a source of information out. On the flip side, when we underestimate our knowledge levels, we look too much. We don't recognize what we know and the ability that we already have to make a decision, and spend more time than necessary looking for information to help guide us in our decision making. Along those same lines, we have issues with learning. When we overestimate our knowledge levels, learning becomes a challenge because we don't see the need to do it, right? We already assume that we know a lot about the topic. When we hear information that conflicts with what we already think we know, we reject it. We prevent ourselves from learning. On the flip side, when we underestimate our knowledge levels, we try to learn more than we need to, and we end up potentially confusing ourselves even more, actually decreasing what we know on the specific topic. And then finally, our attitudes and perceptions are affected by this knowledge congruence or incongruence. When we overestimate our knowledge levels, we end up with more extreme positions. Not only are these positions often more extreme, but they're less malleable. We get stuck. We have very rigid attitudes and views on whatever the issue is. On the flip side, when we underestimate our knowledge levels, we by default go to a more moderate position, whether that's appropriate or not. Not only do we go to a more moderate position and have more moderate attitudes, those attitudes are very malleable. A little bit of information can move us one way or the other, whether it should or not. So with this in mind, how do we get there? We can see that the knowledge congruence impacts our decision-making and ultimately our outcomes. So what leads to this? Here I'd like to share a story. A few years ago, I was talking to someone who worked as a data analyst. And in this conversation, he mentioned that he didn't believe in climate change because he hadn't seen any data that supported it. So because of his position, I was curious and I asked, what data have you looked at? And after a little bit of back and forth, he admitted, well, I haven't actually looked at any data. So he came to this conclusion about climate change based on the information, or based on his skill set, but didn't actually use it to decide what he thought. There are at least a couple of things going on here. A little bit of background. His values and ideology would not allow him to accept the idea that climate change was real. It wouldn't fit with who he was. So our values and our ideology are very important to us. And when something conflicts with that, we don't accept this challenge to who we are. We don't seek information and try to actually learn more. We defend ourselves by raising what we think we know about that issue. In turn, creating a gap and having challenges in terms of actually learning and gaining the knowledge that we think we already have. Second, in this story, he used his experience in data analysis to justify his position, not having gone through any actual data analysis. We draw on our experience to justify what we already think very often. In this case, that's what he did. The second issue with experience is that while it does raise our actual knowledge levels, very often making us experts, while our actual knowledge levels raise, what we think we know often raises much higher than the things we actually learn, creating a gap that may not have existed before we developed the experience in a given area. So we've talked about specific ideas, right? Like things, specific areas of knowledge. Personality can impact our knowledge congruence across an array of areas. For example, narcissists. We all expect those people to think that they know a lot more than they actually do across topics. On the flip side, you have people who are more conscientious, who take the time to evaluate what they actually know and are better able to figure out what they need to do to either learn more if they need to learn more. So a lot of personality characteristics can come into play in terms of assessing our own knowledge levels. And then finally, much like our values and ideology, our emotions impact the knowledge congruence. When we feel angry about something, we assume that it's because we know something about whatever made us angry. We don't get angry and think, well, I don't know anything about that, but I'm still very upset. So our emotions can significantly impact not our actual knowledge levels, but our perceived knowledge levels, and creating a gap there. So we can see that this incongruence in our knowledge can lead to a lot of negative outcomes, which leads to the question of what can we do? Unfortunately, there's not really any simple answer. There are a couple of things that can kind of help guide us. First, what we think we know is not developed in a vacuum. We compare ourselves to others. When we think about how much we know, it's in comparison to others. So thinking about who you're comparing yourself to is one of the first steps that we can take to figure out just how much we actually know about an issue. Are you comparing yourselves to peers or to experts? Are you comparing yourself to someone that you're having a Facebook argument with, that kind of thing? Second, they say the first step to recovery is admitting you have a problem. None of us are immune to these issues. Estimating our own knowledge levels is something, because of our values, because of the different emotions that we have, that is going to impact us all. So simply accepting that at some point there will be issues that we will have these problems with is the first step in being able to recognize that we are maybe too emotionally involved to accurately assess our knowledge, to be able to take a step back, think about what we actually know, and then go from there. Ultimately, by being able to be more introspective and analyze what we actually know, we'll be able to make better decisions in our daily lives, at work, and then as a society as a whole. So the challenge for all of us then is to always seek to discover the things that we don't know. Thank you.